President Obama has been wielding his executive power here and abroad like some would say he were a king. There is speculation that he could incorrectly invoke the 14th Amendment to raise unilaterally the debt ceiling, a move the president has not ruled out when asked about it. Has he forgotten that America is not a monarchy? Here to discuss is senior fellow at the Independent Institute, Charles Peña. Charles, it's always a pleasure. Welcome here. What are we to do? And it isn't just this president, but many of his predecessors have done the same. And unless the laws get stronger, his successors will probably do so. When the president openly and notoriously takes power that the Constitution gives to the Congress and exercises that power himself, and the Congress does nothing about it.
Well, unfortunately, Congress has been complicit in this turn of events in creating what amounts to an imperial presidency over the last several decades. This isn't a new phenomena, particularly when we look at foreign policy and the president's, the executive branch's power to use military force and wage war. Congress long ago abdicated its responsibility to declare war. They enacted the War Powers Resolution, which essentially hands over that decision to the executive branch. And Congress never looks at the issue of whether U.S. national security is at stake when the president decides that he wants to use military force. So we've been down this road for quite a while, and unfortunately, I don't see that there's going to be any way out.
Do you think this is a case-by-case incident? In other words, do you think that because Gaddafi, we're talking about Libya now, and the president bombing in Libya, he says it's not a war because Americans haven't died, and I hope no Americans die, but it's a war by the definition of those on the ground. Do you think that members of Congress are looking the other way because Gaddafi is universally hated and life probably would be better in that part of the world for human freedom were he not there? Or do you think that Congress is basically a potted plant, essentially riddled with timidity when it comes to the president and his war making?
Well, whether it's the Balkans, Iraq, or now Libya, this is largely being done for political purposes. Almost every member of Congress, and I would argue even most of the American public, would agree that Gaddafi's a thug, just like Saddam Hussein was a thug and Slobodan Milosevic before him was a thug. But that's not a reason to engage U.S. military forces. The only reason to engage U.S. military forces is if U.S. national security is at risk. In none of those three cases, I would argue, was U.S. national security at risk. And the problem is, of course, for the politicians, if it's their party in the White House, they want to support their president's decision to use military force. But when it's not their party in the White House, they find some way to object. So in the case of Iraq, you had Democrats complaining about President Bush because he didn't consult the UN and bring in the international community.
Right.
And now in the case of Libya, you have Republicans complaining because the president didn't consult with Congress. But in both those cases, Congress hasn't looked at the real issue, which is national security at stake, that it requires putting our soldiers in harm's way.
Right. All right. We only have about a minute left, Charles. Is there something about war? Is there something about the concept of putting human beings, our fellow Americans, in harm's way that causes timidity on the part of Congress? I mean, Congress wasn't timid in 1973 when Richard Nixon invaded Cambodia, and over his veto, the Congress enacted the War Powers Act. But it seems like every instance since then, the Congress has been afraid to restrain the president because they somehow think that by doing so, they're going to harm American troops that are already there.
Well, I think from the standpoint of Republicans or conservatives, I think they're more predisposed to be a little more hawkish and use military force. On the part of Democrats and liberals, they're actually afraid of being criticized for not being strong on national security. So at least in this administration, you have a lot of Democrats supporting the president, one, because it's their president, but
right,
also because they don't want to be accused of being weak on national security.
Charles Peña, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.